Pretty good.
Well, I was just looking at your video on history camp.
Ah, yes. That
I
was
don't
a
know.
while ago now.
I just looked you up about half an hour ago on there and just found it. I don't know when it was exactly, but
Yeah.
thought it was pretty neat.
Thanks. Yeah. And thanks for your kind words about my book. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I had heard about the book and listened to the podcast.
Okay.
I haven't read the book,
Gotcha. Okay.
but yeah, I listened. I was just doing some of
All
my
good.
own fun Civil War research, I guess, just doing battles and
Yeah.
whatnot, and looked up some Civil War podcasts, and you were on one of them. I was looking
Yeah.
up. I don't know how I landed on yours specifically, but I listened to it and enjoyed it. And you
Yeah.
looked like a guy kind of
Yeah.
around my
Thanks.
age. I think I'm 23.
I
Um,
am almost 10 years older than you. I look younger
okay,
than I am, but
yeah,
yeah.
you look
Not too
young.
far.
No worries. And I thought it was cool to see just a young guy into Civil War history. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm not super deep into it, but I like it, and so I wanted to reach out and just chat.
Sure. Yeah.
Cool.
Sure. Are you a history major or where does your interest stem from?
My interest, I just started when I was a kid. I played a Civil War game on PlayStation 2 or something.
Nice. Yeah.
Very similar to Call of Duty, and my brother and I just liked it as much, if not more, than the original Call of Duties back
Yeah.
in like early 2000s. We just loved it, and from there we were
Yeah.
always just into little Civil War stuff. But no, I'm not a history major or anything. I'm majoring in psychology and neuroscience right now in Wisconsin,
Oh, cool.
and
Yeah.
you know, we'll see. But I love history
Yeah.
and just love poking around and looking up stuff and kind of genealogy and family history too, which I
Hmm.
think you did
Yeah.
some research in as well. Well, you
Quite a bit.
looked up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of where my interest in what you were doing came
Hmm.
about. Is you kind of were an intersection of Civil War and family history, and
Right.
kind
Yeah.
of put those two together for your own use.
Yeah. I think that's kind of why I originally got interested in it, right? Because of family stories and like things that were handed down. And so that's kind of why I started looking. And then the more I looked, kind of the more I found. And it was kind of related to my family, but at this point, like I've been researching this regiment for over 15 years, a really long time. So, the things that I've been researching have kind of diverged from my own family history and stuff like that to some extent. But yeah, it's incredible how much information is out there that is just kind of waiting to be found. Because as many things are online now, there's so much more that's like sitting in an archive or in someone's closet, or and just no one's ever seen it before. So that's one of the really cool things for me, right? Like finding that thing that no one's really seen before and figuring out what it means, and putting it somewhere where people can enjoy it, right? Like a podcast or posting it online or something like that.
Absolutely. That's totally what I'm into. I just love sorting niche stuff
Yeah.
out and finding it. So what I usually do is I'm already running, and then I'll start it at whatever point works best naturally. Recording, I mean, on my computer
Oh,
here.
okay.
Yeah, and so anything you want edited out or changed, just let me know, and at the end, yeah, we'll figure it out from there. But I
What are
mostly
you going to use that for?
just YouTube, mostly. Just my own interest.
Oh,
I like
okay.
to talk to people, see what they're doing, have them tell me all
Oh,
about
gotcha.
what
Okay.
they're passionate
Yeah.
about and why, and the research they've
Okay.
done in their area. And um, I'll post it on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok,
Cool.
anywhere,
Okay.
just for fun
Yeah.
mostly.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Sure.
Awesome. So were crossing in family history and Civil War history, you said?
Mhm.
And how did that look
Yeah.
like for you originally?
So I don't know the exact term. I always forget it. She was like my great grand aunt or something. So my grandfather's aunt, like way back, she, yeah, I know it's hard to think about.
Mm-hmm.
She lived until 2007. And so I knew her, and she was the one who kind of started telling me stories about, like, oh, my grandfather was in the Civil War. And she didn't really know anything about this. Um, but she knew that he had been wounded at Gettysburg. And there was this family story that he did not talk about the war. except to her father, and swore her father to secrecy. He never talked about it. And that he also went on a trip every year, and that she knew it had something to do with the war. The place he was going was never shared. Like what he was doing while he was there was never shared, but he went every year. And so based on like that story, I was kind of like, okay, something happened to this guy during the war that he never got over it, right? There was something that happened to him. And so I wanted to figure out kind of what that was. And this was back, like I was like maybe 12 years old. I was really young. I was just starting to get interested in the Civil War. And a lot of stuff wasn't online back then, right? This was like very early
Mm-hmm.
mass broad internet, that kind of era. And so we actually had to do, I grew up very close to where this guy was from. And so we had to do a lot of like local archive searching and things of that sort. Um, and finally figured out like what regiment he was in, and then kind of started looking into like what that regiment had done. And that led me down the whole path to actually writing the book. That's what started that. So that's kind of where the family history got me interested in it. And then I found out more about my family from that research.
And he turned out to be a captain in the 46th Pennsylvania. Was
He,
that
so my ancestor was actually a corporal, and his captain was this George Brooks guy.
okay? So yeah, your book is on
Yeah.
George Brooks, but your
Yes.
relative was with him in these locations.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
they served together. And the thing that got me interested in that was that, so I was researching the regiment. I came across this George Brooks guy, um, and I saw that he'd been killed at Antietam. And I knew that my ancestor had named his firstborn son Brooks Ellsworth Boyer, which is a very like Ellsworth. Okay, that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? But we never knew what the name Brooks was. That didn't make it wasn't a family name. Nobody else was named that. We had no idea. It was just kind of like a weird name to have in the family. And when I saw that, I was kind of like, oh, his captain was Brooks. Like, there is no way that he didn't do this intentionally, right? This captain obviously meant something to him. And once I found out that George Brooks's diary still existed, I was like, okay, I want to read that. Like, who was this guy? And that's really what kicked off learning about him that led to the book. Yeah.
Okay. So it was. Let's see if I can trace it back correctly. Your second-ish great aunt's grandfather was
Yes.
the
Yeah.
corporal that
Yeah.
uh, George Brooks was in.
Brooks.
Yeah.
Yes.
Was his
Yes.
first name George? Was that right?
Yeah.
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 So through the rabbit hole, you found the family connection that this Brooks guy was
Indeed.
so impressive that he named his son after your so and so great grandfather named his son after him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that's quite like a winding trail of family
Totally.
history, but yeah. Yeah, but it's just like yeah, I just wanted to learn more. I thought it seems like my ancestor had a from other stories, it seems like he was successful in business. He was active in the local Republican Party after the war. Like there's a picture of him um, quite late in his life, like 1905, as she died 10 years later, with his whole family. And he like has his arm around his wife. They died 4 days apart of natural causes. So, and there's a smile, like you can tell there's a smile on his face. So, like, how does this guy go from just like the devastation of the Civil War and the awful, awful things he had to go through, which I learned about, eventually learned what they were, and goes on to live like a pretty good life. And I was like, that's a really interesting thing to consider. Which I'm sure, like, if you're learning about psychology and stuff like that, I'm sure that's interesting to you too.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I don't know if you've read, there's a great book. Here I have it. Marching Home,
Ooh.
Union veterans and their unending Civil War. If you're looking for something to read, I really recommend this. It's a lot of stuff about like what these guys had to deal with once they went home, and the fact that they were dealing with the same things as soldiers nowadays. They had PTSD, and sort of like the ways that society even back then was kind of like, okay, the war's over, let's move on, and really didn't give them a lot of validation about what they had been through during the war. So it's very interesting. There's a lot of good stories in there. Um, but I think a lot of times when we learn about the Civil War, it's kind of like, okay, it started in 1861, ended in 1865, you're done. And that's not how that sort of thing works. It had an immense impact on society, and families, and everything like that.
Wow. Yeah, you never hear about the PTSD and the aftermath of the Civil War, other than
Yeah,
maybe the general Reconstruction period in the
right,
1880s. That's as far as
right.
I've heard it impact long term. So that's really
Yeah,
cool. Did you ever
yeah.
figure
There's
out
that.
what happened to your grandfather so and so? What his story
Yeah,
ended up being? That was why he
yeah,
never talked about it. What was the fallout from that after all this research?
yeah. I mean, I think the long and short of it is that he served all 4 years of the war, part of it under George Brooks. And they were involved in some really brutal combat. We're talking like hand to hand fighting, um, using rifles as clubs, rocks. He lost a large number of friends who were either killed, wounded multiple times, taken prisoner of war. Um, and he himself, I mean, one of the family stories was that he had damaged his feet during the war. And I learned, and this is in the book, from George Brooks's diary, that they were doing stuff like marching 26 miles through the snow without shoes on. Just stuff that like I can't even imagine. I can't imagine walking 100 feet without shoes on outside,
Mm-hmm.
let alone doing something like that. Um, and they were marching, I mean, like hundreds and hundreds of miles, in the heat, in the cold. All this, they were suffering from exposure at some points because they weren't getting adequate food. They didn't have adequate shelter. Just these unimaginable hardships on top of, all the psychological trauma that they were going through. He was 18 when he enlisted, so he was a young guy. Um, and the worst thing that ever happened to him was hurting his feet, and he lost the tip of a finger. Whereas other guys that he served with, like George Brooks, died
Mm-hmm.
quite young,
Yeah.
or were mortally wounded or maimed permanently or something like that. And I can't imagine, like, I can imagine how, and that Marching Home book kind of goes into this, where um, roles in society were different back then, obviously. There were certain things that you didn't talk about around women and children, and war and the realities of it were kind of one of them, right? So a lot of these guys didn't feel like they could share their experiences with other people. One, because it wasn't socially acceptable. Two, because the other people wouldn't understand if they weren't fellow veterans. And so it was very lonely for them. They didn't really have anyone to share these things with. So like all of that is, why he didn't talk about it, why he didn't want um, people in his family to know. And I don't know. I think it's kind of sad that he must have been that isolated, with those experiences.
Yeah. Wow. And they were in the Union Army, Brooks and your grandfather, relatives.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes.
You stereotypically you'd think that they were usually better equipped. That
Right.
I almost wouldn't
Yes.
attribute that type of really hardship to the
Yeah.
well-established, federal Union Army.
Right, exactly. And that was one of the things I found really interesting as when I was learning about this, because that's exactly what they teach you in school, right? That
Mm-hmm.
the
Yep.
Union Army was so much better equipped. And by the end of the war, right, that is true, right? By the end of the war, much like in World War One, the federal government has established so much manufacturing capacity that, I mean, there's more than enough, right? But the part of the war that my book covers, and that early war soldiers experienced, that manufacturing capacity did not exist yet. We were certainly, the North was certainly ahead of the South, when it came to manufacturing, but they were still having trouble like switching because clothing factories they had to switch over to producing uniforms instead of civilian clothing, and like all this took time. um, and so for a large part, I mean, soldiers were really experiencing trouble getting food, equipment. I don't know if you've heard the stories of like Union regiments who were initially outfitted in gray uniforms, and it caused a lot of confusion. The whole like blue and gray thing is
Yeah.
kind of a lie. Um, and so, they were doing things like marching without shoes. And so, a lot of times, civilians back home were stepping up to provide things like socks and blankets and all this kind of thing to local regiments, so they would have the equipment they needed. But they were missing a lot of things until later in the war.
Wow. So that lie between blue and the gray, was it maybe later in the war that got established then, or was it kind of mixed and matched throughout?
That's a modern conception. I think it's
Interesting.
just like an easy way of differentiating it. But yeah, there were certainly Union regiments that were wearing gray uniforms early in the war. Um, there were Southern regiments that were wearing like every color you can imagine, right?
Right.
They didn't care because they didn't have, again, manufacturing capacity. So they were like, okay, fabric, let's use it.
Yeah.
They didn't really care. And then, of course, there were Union regiments that had all kinds of different uniforms, right? You have Zouaves, you have Verdansk sharpshooters that were wearing green for the most part. Um, there's some really great books out there that have all the different. You can look at like all the different. I used to like to do that when I was a kid. I'd look at all the different types of uniforms and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So yeah, it was all over the place.
Very cool. Yeah, I even just I play a few PC games now, some Civil War type games, and they always like throw in the Zouaves in there with their goofy hats and their
Yes, they're very
stripes, and
popular.
it's so goofy. Um,
Yeah,
you transcribed a bunch of letters too, didn't you? Was it of
yeah,
Brooks? And those
yes.
were first hand letters that he had written,
Hmm.
first person.
Hmm.
And you, yeah, I heard about that. And so, what was your purpose behind transcribing those? Was it because it was hard to read and you wanted to preserve
Hmm.
them, or what was your passion behind that project?
Yeah, so that came out of I was researching the book, right? So I transcribed his diary, which had been used in different, it had been used in books and different sources before because it is a really good account of the Shenandoah Valley campaign and stuff like that. Um, but it had never been transcribed and published in its entirety. And so my whole thing was that I kind of wanted to see if my ancestor was mentioned in it, which, spoiler alert, he wasn't, which isn't really surprising. But once I had transcribed it, I was like, okay, this should probably be published. This shouldn't just be sitting in a library, because it is hard. It is difficult to read if you're not used to reading old time handwriting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so originally I was just going to publish that, right? So it'd be like a little pamphlet, nothing too fancy. Um, and from things he had written in a diary, I figured out that he had been writing other things. And so he was mentioning like sending things off to the local newspaper back home. And so I went and I found that. And then I went on this, and I can tell you the story if you want. It's kind of a long one, but I ended up finding out that his descendants still had some of his stuff, and they're the ones that had the letters.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, for as far as I know, I don't think they'd ever read them. It's over 80 letters that he had sent home, a lot of letters. It's from 1858 until basically right up until his death. Um, and so again, hard to read, right? And so I scanned those and then I typed them all up. And they really provided a lot of context that wasn't in the diary about sort of who he was, what his life was like, um, other things that he was doing that he didn't necessarily put into his diary because his diary was kind of social stuff, but also predominantly like military things that were going on. And I realized that like not including them in the book would really leave out sort of his personal side, and getting to know him as a person, and that extra information about what he was doing. And so part of it was like making sure it was preserved. The other part was like, okay, there's no way this can't be published alongside the diary because it complements it so well. And so that's why the book is the diary, the letters, and the newspaper articles that he wrote. And then I provide sort of like the context of why things were happening because he didn't, he obviously didn't know that. He didn't have that information.
Wow, that's a heck of a project then to put together.
It was a big project. Yeah.
And so okay, so on the podcast, correct me if I'm wrong, it took you was it 8 years to kind of put everything? It was a
Probably more.
longer,
Yeah.
okay. And
Very long time.
you
Yeah.
received the letters in your college dorm room.
Yes. Yeah, that was really stressful, because the mailroom in my apartment building was awful and they would lose stuff all the time. So his descendants, they were just like, yeah, we'll just put them in the mail for you. So it arrived in this like probably 2 by 2 by 2 foot box because it was a ton of them. And I got like the delivery notification. I like rushed down to the package room and I was like, "Oh, my package is here. Can I have my package? Can I have my package?" And the dude was like super annoyed with me. He was like, "I don't know where that is." And I was like, "No, it just came here. Like, can I have it?" And I think I had to go back like 3 times before he found it. Over the course of, I was like driving this guy insane. But so I get the box of letters, and then I had to like humidify them because they were so brittle from being folded
Wow.
for 140 years or whatever. Um, and so I had like big, this big like uh, plastic storage containers, right? And I would take those and like set them out on the floor in my apartment and lay out the letters inside elevated, and you put like containers of water under it to get some humidity in it so they could kind of
Did you have
unfold.
roommates at the time, or did you have a space at
I
least
didn't at the
alone?
time. I was in like a 400 square foot studio apartment, with
Okay.
all my Civil War letters spread out. Yeah, that would have been really weird with
That's
roommates,
some
but
like Nicolas Cage stuff, spreading out the Constitution on a lampshade,
yeah.
just like going crazy as you're looking over. What was that like opening up that box, realizing like what you had were over 140-year-old personal
Yeah.
handwritten letters? I mean, that is every historian's dream, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, so yes, I'm not a professional historian, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I don't think I realized I knew what it was, but I don't think I really fully grasped this project until I got older. And sort of like what it meant, maybe until I like actually had my own book in my own hands and was like, if I hadn't done this, people wouldn't be hearing the story, right? And so that really put it in perspective for me. But like getting that box, I think at that point I was just like super excited. I was like, I can't wait to see what's in these letters. Um, and I had to be patient, right? Because I couldn't just like throw them open and start reading. I had to do like humidify them and scan them and then start transcribing them, which took quite a bit of time, right? Because I don't have you ever seen Civil War letters? When they didn't have enough
I've
paper,
seen old letters, but
they
maybe not the way you're talking about. No.
yeah. So let me wish I had the scan up. But so when they didn't have enough paper, they would I don't know if you can
I've
see
seen an
this.
old letter
They'd
on the
write
back of a newspaper before.
they'd write one way like this, then they'd flip it 90 degrees and they'd write the other way
Really?
to say paper. Yeah.
And you could read it like
And
that.
so a lot of his letters were like that, and it was a nightmare to read it because it's like scrolly old time text, right? Um,
Huh. So you
so
are
it
able
took a
to pick
while.
out text in two directions, though. That's
Hmm.
technically
Yeah.
you were. I've never heard of that. That's nuts. I've seen an
Yeah.
old relative of mine who wrote a letter home from the 1850s in the gold rush. He had sent a letter home
Yeah.
saying he had found a significant amount of gold, and then he disappeared on his way back. Don't know where he
Oh,
went. Yeah,
wow.
but
Yeah.
it was on the back of a newspaper, I think, is what he had used or something,
Yeah.
or a pamphlet.
Yeah.
And yeah, that old timey handwriting. I thought I can't read modern cursive too well. Forget about
Right.
1850s cursive.
Yeah. You eventually you kind of learn it, and eventually I learned his handwriting specifically. So if there was like a letter that I wasn't quite sure, and like that's the level it got to, right? It would be like let me figure out what this one letter is in this word. Because sometimes, like when you write yourself, sometimes your words don't quite turn out the way they're supposed to. And that would happen. So it'd be like, okay, I have to figure out like some of the letters in this word, and then maybe I can figure out what the word is. And yeah, it was time consuming.
Is it what it sounds like? You just took one letter at a time and went letter for letter, typing out this date, so and so, and then you just transcribed it that way, or did you? What did that look
It
like
was,
specifically transcribing stacks of old letters?
yeah, it was more like I would read until I would read normally, like read words, type them up until I got to a word that I couldn't tell what it was. And that's where I would be like zooming in and trying to like figure out which way the pen was going to see what letters it might be to try to figure out the word. And then I had a lot of like I had a lot of people who helped me with the book over time. One of which was my mom, and I'd like send her a picture of the word, and I'd be like, "Do you think this is this?" And she'd be like, "Maybe," or "Maybe it's that." Um, and it was weird because my depending on who you ask, right? They know different things, and so sometimes I just ask the right person at the right time, and they'd be like, "Oh, that's that word." And be like, "How?" Like, because he would make literary references and societal references that just don't really like that. I didn't know, but maybe somebody else would know that. I think an example is
Like
like,
what? Yeah, like what? I'm very curious. It's got to be a heck of an insight into society back then if he's just referencing all this
oh
stuff.
yeah, yeah. One it would be like, oh, what is it? There's a term for dancing. It's like trip the toe fantastic light or something like that. It's like really,
Sure.
really weird. And
Yeah.
I think my mom knew what that meant. And I was just like, how? So yeah, it was just like, and yeah, like people I know who know stuff, a lot of stuff about the Civil War, I would ask them stuff sometimes and they'd be like, oh, he's talking about that. I'm like, all right, there you go.
Interesting.
And I
Wow.
think, I think we got it down to there's maybe, I'd say less than 10 words or references in the book that I couldn't figure out. And the entire thing. And I think like I'm proud of that, like that I was able to add that much context to it, so that pieces of meaning aren't lost when the
Right.
reader is looking at it. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite letter that you were like, this is the one, this is the letter that you frame it, you stare at it, like what's significant out of that whole stack of personal writings? What stood out to you the most?
So the book actually, and I don't know, you might be able to see this on Amazon in the preview, but
Let me take a look.
the book opens with a quote by him. Let me see if we can. Um, so one of the things that he did for the regiment, because he was such a good writer, um, was he served as a recruiting officer for them. Yeah, you can't see it on Amazon. Um,
Is it in the picture? I'm on Amazon now. Is it on the picture of the book? There's a front cover and a back cover. Is it on the back or
I
where is
can
it?
actually just share.
Yeah, you can
Oh,
share.
it says I can't share.
Yeah, I might need to actually pay for. Let me check. Zoom. Okay, no, there we go. Try that.
There you go.
Connect. Okay, cool.
Yeah, you seeing this?
Yep.
Um, so this is a quote from one of the newspaper articles that he wrote home to be published in the local paper, to try to encourage men to come join the regiment in the field. And so you can read it later. He goes through this whole thing about how the war might not be short, um, but that if you come serve in a regiment, you'll know that you've earned the glorious title of an American citizen. And that's where the title of the book comes from. Um, and I think this always just kind of really stuck with me because it's beautifully written. It really encapsulates the sentiment at that time of the war, right before he died, and it, it's right before he dies. So he is about to make this incredible sacrifice. He doesn't know it, and it just kind of sums up like everything that he did, and made a great book title. So that's the one that's always really hit me. But he would write stuff home, like um, he really wanted to go home around this time. Like he was kind of done with the whole war thing. Um, and he would write things like, I just really wish I could come home. And it's just like reading that, and it's kind of like a movie where you know the ending and you don't like it, and you're thinking like, wow, I really wish this ended differently, because like he's going to be dead in 2 months. He's not going to go home. So it was actually quite hard to read sometimes.
And he died. Was it a what was the battle? Something Hill. What?
Antietam.
Oh, Antietam. Right, you mentioned that. Who?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if I got that confused somewhere else. How did he die in Antietam? Did you get that story? I know he had died, but
Yeah.
how, who, when, where? Do you know the
Yeah.
story on
So
it?
are you familiar with Antietam at all? If not, I can kind of go into
Not
more
in super
detail.
detail. I know there was just a
Okay.
lot of close combat fighting, and it was really
Okay.
bloody lane and the some
Okay.
big front
So yeah.
lines, but not the movements or who was there or anything really.
Yeah. Okay. So he went into the East Woods. So you're talking like northwest of the Bloody Lane,
Hmm.
kind of early in the morning. Um, and this is when Hooker's corps has just got pushed into the cornfield, and they get repulsed. And Brooks's corps, 12th Corps, starts to move into the East Woods. And it's quite chaotic. They've just received a bunch of new regiments in their brigade and division, and the veteran regiments at this point are so small that they're like the size of a company or less, a company being 100 men. So you're going from like a normal strength regiment is like 600 to 900 men, and these older regiments are down to less than 100 guys. And so the older regiments are trying to help the new regiments get on the line so they can go into combat. There's a lot of sniper fire coming from the trees. Um, and because of what had happened to them at Cedar Mountain, which I think is the battle you were thinking of, you
Yep,
said
Cedar
Hill, yeah,
Mountain. Yeah, yep,
yeah.
Cedar Mountain.
They had been so badly decimated there that they didn't have many officers with them. George Brooks was actually the only line officer with the 46th Pennsylvania, other than Lieutenant Colonel. And so they're like NCOs leading what was left of companies. They were very, you could just say like short staffed, right? They didn't have a lot of leadership on the field. And so George Brooks and some other officers go to try to help these other regiments. And so they're kind of rushing around trying to get these guys lined up. It's a mess. The officers in the new regiments, there's actually a monument to Colonel Colgrove of the 128th Pennsylvania at Antietam, because he's shot and killed. Their lieutenant colonel is either wounded or mortally wounded. I'm not sure. I can't remember which right now. But as you can imagine, like they're watching their officers go down, and these young soldiers who have never been in combat before, they're just freaking out. And so the older officers of what's left of them are trying to push these guys and get them in a line. And it's somewhere in like this ridiculous amount of chaos. You can imagine there's just like there's bullets flying everywhere. There's artillery. There's people. There's just an absolute mess. Brooks is shot in the head, and he dies instantly. So he's just gone. And no one. It's chaos, right? So no one records like exactly how it happened, exactly where it happened. It could have been, I think it was probably in the East Woods, maybe sort of like in the lower corner of the cornfield, which is where they lined up this regiment. There's a monument for them in the cornfield. Um, and so, yeah, that's it. That's it for him. It just ends.
Have you visited those locations yourself? The
Yeah. Oh,
battlefields?
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I assume so. You had said that.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to go to those battlefields. That's so cool.
Yeah.
That
They
history.
just did a huge restoration of the East Woods and Antietam to make it look more like it did at the time of the battle.
Oh,
So
really?
it's a lot easier to conceptualize kind of what was going on. Before it was like really overgrown. It was hard to kind of tell where things were.
What did it look like? What did they add to it?
Th-
Was it just more
then or
over
now,
both? What does it look like now to make it look like what it looked like then?
they took out a lot of forest, um, and there was a stone wall and a fence back then. Um, so it was already kind of there, but they kind of rebuilt it, and they cleaned up a lot of the overgrown trees and stuff like that. They keep it mowed now, like it's a farmer's field. So it's just, you can just kind of see where the ground is. Cause I mean, I don't know, maybe you're probably somewhat aware of this because of playing those video games, but like, topography played such a huge role in Civil War combat, to an extent that a lot of people don't realize, um, because they were on foot, right? So it was very, very, if they had to go up even a slight hill, that could be a huge impediment if you're going into like direct fire from the enemy or something like that. So that's why a lot of times, I mean, they do this a lot at Gettysburg, where they'll restore the battlefield to how it looked back then. So it's easier for people to understand, like, oh, there was a hill, there's a hill right there that I couldn't see when there's a bunch of trees growing up over it, because that could be really impactful for what happened during the battle.
Gotcha. And they were in lines too, so it's like literally a plus and minus. So if they were on the downhill, they were done for because they
Yes.
had to. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. I This is totally a nerdy thing. I was part of this online Civil War regiment in this video game for about 6 months to a year. We did actually
Yeah.
reenact Antietam, and I
Mhm.
think we were on the Confederate side with the 6th Louisiana, and I think the guys we were fighting again were the 46th
Oh,
Pennsylvania.
really?
Those were like the other guys who had filled in to
Yeah.
play the role of our
Yeah.
enemies. And they were our big, dogs that we were fighting in the match, and it was
Yeah.
a blast. And that's where my Antietam knowledge comes from, is because we actually had a guy come in. I think he was just familiar with the history of it and explained basically that,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
the,
that's
the
really
just
cool.
chaotic fighting of Antietam.
Yeah.
Did they have a church there as well, or was that
Yeah.
Shiloh?
Dunker Church.
Okay, Dunker
Dunker
Church.
Church.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep, I was
And
familiar with
that
that
was
one.
just sort of the focal point. It was like a thing they could all recognize, and so they just kind of, it was like, okay, where do we go? Go toward that thing. Like everybody knows where that thing is. Go toward the white church. You know, it was just something they could all understand where it was.
That makes sense. Do you game at all on PC or anything? Play any video
No,
games?
I took it one step further, nerd wise, and I actually did Civil War reenacting
Oh,
for
there you go.
quite a while as a kid. Which, I think it's like, um, civil war reenacting is not as in vogue as it once was. There was a really big contingent of people doing it, back in the 90s and the early 2000s. I think it's pretty political at this point. And so for various reasons, time amongst them, I don't do it anymore and I kind of stay away from it. But it was an amazing learning experience, right? And I think video games can be too, right? Because you took the time to learn the history as you're playing through it. Um, and so that's like, I don't know, I definitely talk to people who are like, civil reenacting is wrong. I don't understand why you would do it. Like, they really go far. And it's like, no, it's an incredible learning tool. Like, you have to have the information there, you have to have the history there, right? For it to be meaningful. But, so much of what I learned about, um, tactics and the hardships they went through, and what it was like to a very small degree to be a Civil War soldier came from reenacting and actually having those experiences. So I still think it's cool, but that's
Yeah,
just me.
totally. And we're all just history nerds. Just
Yeah, right.
I would love your opinion on some of these games that I played over the years, because I've looked up, like you just said, the history, meaning the history of the battles that they put you in the games, but also the developer's
Yeah.
way of recreating it. Because
Uh-huh.
there's War of Rights is one of them, where the developer's goal was to recreate the battlefield as realistically as possible. And
Okay, that's cool.
Antietam was
Yeah.
one of them. And then this other one that just came out, I was listening to a podcast. It's a group of people, I think in the Netherlands, that are super into Civil War reenacting. They just love
Yeah,
United
there's a
States
lot of
history.
partners that are really, yeah.
Yeah, that surprised me. Foreigners that are super into our Civil War
Hmm.
history just because of where it was placed in the timeline of war, basically.
Yes, yes.
And their goal was more video game like, was to use the settings, but then make it more playable and use the
Yeah,
free. And so maybe I'll send you a video of each one and get your idea of that.
yeah, sure.
Two
Yeah,
totally
that'd be
different
cool.
goals for interpreting Civil War era into video game format,
Yeah,
and it's so cool.
yeah,
It's
that's really cool.
fascinating. That's awesome. Do you have a favorite? I suppose I'd say favorite battle is probably the ones that you researched yourself.
Mhm.
But outside of that, what's your biggest attraction? Maybe historic. Let's go there. Biggest historical attraction. Is it just pertaining to the Civil War, or have you since then branched out into other areas
Uh,
of?
yeah, no, I was raised in a military family, sort of. And so I always was really into military history, sort of any of it. And so I've done research on, World War One, World War Two. But the Civil War was just always sort of like and I couldn't tell you why. It was just like, I think, some people it just gets. And I got interested when I was 10, I think, because we did like a unit at school, and they actually had reenactors come to the school. And I was just like, oh my God, that is so cool that you can see what it would have been like. And that's how I got into reenacting, and that led to more historical research. So yeah, I've done like World War One stuff, World War Two stuff, family history stuff. I really like aviation and things like that. But the Civil War has always been my main focus.
I'm very curious about your reenacting. What those experiences were like.
Yeah,
What was that like? It,
crazy. So I can go as deep on this as you want. So there's reenactors, who it's kind of like uh, camping in Civil War gear, right? So they have a tent, and they'll bring their cot, and they have a sleeping bag, and they have their cooler in their tent, and they just dress up in Civil War clothes and go have like a fake battle, and it's kind of cheesy. And I did that for 7 years, maybe, all through my teenage years. And I mean, it was really great because it's a lot of families. It's a very like family friendly environment. It was kind of like, so I didn't do Boy Scouts or anything like that. And this was kind of like my thing, right? And that's where I got a lot of structure and mentorship. And it was really great for me as a teenager. It was like the thing I look forward to doing with my life. And I learned a lot about history. But then when I got older in my later teens, there are also reenactors who take it really seriously, and they're the ones that are like trying to do everything authentically, and they're not toting the cooler along with them. And so I got into doing that, and that was like, you have a blanket and you sleep on the ground at night. There's no conveniences. Um, we did events where we would sort of campaign. So we would start in one place, march all day, maybe do like a battle scenario or something like that, sleep, march the next day. So you were constantly changing locations. Um, and I think that was a lot of fun because that was very hard, like physically. It was a taste of what they would have gone through. It was a very like tight knit group. Like you kind of felt like you were in. I won't go so far as say a military unit because I'm sure that's different. I haven't been in the military, so I don't know. But like a cohesive group of people who have like this common interest, and are really committed to it. So like just really good times hanging out with people, and then the history component on top of it. So that's where a lot of my sort of like uh, more specific experiences around like what it would have sort of been like come from was that time, the more authentic reenacting. So that was kind of the scope of what I did. And then when I got to college, like I didn't have the time or the money. So I stopped doing it and I never went back. So that's
Yeah.
kind of how that went.
Did they, the areas that you reenacted in, did they fence off or mark off swaths of land for you to do these quote campaigns on over the course of a few days, or was it, how did they keep it
It
controlled in the area
depended.
of where you
Yeah,
went?
so a lot of reenactments will be on like private property,
Okay.
right? So it'll be like some farmer rents out his farm for reenactment. Um, the one I did that was campaigning, I don't know how they did that logistically. We were on private farms at night, but during the day we were out on like roadways and stuff like that. So they had to get the right. I don't know how that works to have people occupy a road. But there's also, I never did this event, but there is or was a reenactment in Virginia, where it was the entire county. I think it was very rural, and they somehow got permission to use the entire county. And they would have like the Confederates were cavalry, and the Union was infantry. And the whole weekend it was, what did they used to call it? I forget. You were in like Civil War mode all weekend. It was like
Wow.
live all weekend. And so this Confederate cavalry would literally chase the Union infantry all over this county for the weekend. And if you got captured, you were done for the weekend.
Oh
You were
no.
literally captured. Yeah. So there were some pretty crazy stories out of that, like people like hiding in chicken coops and like getting. I mean, I think sometimes the cavalry guys would kind of beat up on the Union guys, and it apparently got pretty intense. But yeah, that was like an entire county that they were able to use. I don't know if they still do that. I
Was
can't.
it was
It's a
it
very different time now.
documented? Were there photographers and people documenting that
No,
action
no,
there or anything?
no.
Okay.
There are reenactments that are called by us for us, and those are no spectators, no public. I
Wow.
those are actually really fun
What are they called?
because by us for us.
By us for
Um,
us. Okay.
yeah. So those are pretty unique. And like that campaign thing I did, a lot of that was no spectators. Um, so yeah, it's good times. Um, yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. That is, I don't know, that's about as real as you
It's a
can
whole
get.
world. It's a whole world. Yeah.
Wow, I just looked up some photos here of just
Yeah.
some people doing it. I guess I'll share my screen just so you can see what I'm looking at. I'm sure it's exactly what you did in some stage, but something like that of
Yeah.
yeah,
So this, what you're seeing right here, so see all the tents further down?
yeah,
So a setup like that, that is like if we're talking Civil War, we're talking like this is an established camp if it's set up like that. And so when they were on campaign, they wouldn't bother to do that.
right,
Um, and so what I did a lot of this where you have like the set up tents and rows. Um, but this is what you would kind of consider an inaccurate reenactment, a lot of times. So when we were doing like campaign style reenactments, which is what you would call it, that's where there's like no tents, no spectators, sometimes spectators, but yeah, generally no tents, just kind of carrying with you what you need to survive. Much more stripped down. These guys have a lot of equipment along with them.
okay, interesting, huh? Wow, that's cool. I've never talked to someone who's done in reenactments like that.
Yeah, it was an experience.
Huh, very cool. Do you have a highlight, or were you hiding in chicken coops or anything? Or
No, I
any
never did that.
stories of just
Uh,
crazy, just odd stuff, or was the whole thing kind of like that?
yeah, the whole thing, like it was all pretty cool. The campaign event I did really stuck with me because it was um, just like the beautiful scenery. We were isolated, like it really felt like you could just you felt like you could be in the Civil War, right? Um, and the experiences we had, it was in the middle of summer, of course, so it was like brutally hot Virginia summer. And so we're like marching down this roadway all day. think we did like 7 miles maybe. And we got to the town we were staying in for the night. And by the time we got there, people were like going down from the heat and stuff like that, which was a very common occurrence during the Civil War, right? Um, and we got to this town and they were having us camp along the river. And this town, it's Port Royal, Virginia. It's still like a very, very tiny town. Um, and they we stopped and the NCOs were just like, get your gear off and jump in the river because they were legitimately afraid that people were getting heat stroke and stuff like that. Some people already had. And so everyone just goes into the river. And it was just like, because there's nothing modern around, just
Yeah.
everybody's splashing around in the river. And it was just like a really cool experience that that's something they would have done, right? That's like living it. So that was really cool. Yeah.
Oh wow, I love that. That's so much fun.
Yeah.
Do you have any projects you're working on now? Anything else? Any new books you're working on, or any goals for the future that you're like, this is it, it's happening?
Not Civil War related, no. I think, my book published in 2019. It's really great to publish a book right before a pandemic. It's great for marketing. So like I've been doing some events when I can. Um, it's so going, I have a small publisher. I was lucky to not have to self-publish, obviously. But they don't have the resources to really do any promotion or anything like that. So I'm kind of on the hook for, like finding things like that podcast or going to an event or, I've like written articles for magazines. I have a Facebook group, like I have all that stuff. But I have to like figure it all out, right? I have to go email people and all that stuff. And it's really time consuming and like not particularly enjoyable to be like, hey, can I come on your podcast? And like one person says yes, but five others say no or don't respond. So yeah, I devote some time to marketing, kind of do the best I can with that. Um, I do, so my professional work is completely separate it's not history related at all. So it can be hard to like find time to do that kind of stuff.
You work in DC,
So
don't you?
yeah, yeah, I do.
Awesome. I was an intern up there. It's a beautiful area.
Yeah.
It's so pretty.
Other than when it's super swampy. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And what do you do up there?
I am a web developer. So
Okay. Very
totally
tech
different
savvy.
from Civil War book writing. Yeah.
No, I love that's the hobbies are where it's at. I love it. I love hearing
Yeah.
about people's hobbies.
Yeah.
So what do you do in your free time now then?
Uh, I don't have much of it right now.
Okay, well thanks for using it to talk
Yeah.
to a guy like
Yeah.
me
No,
then.
that's all right.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. No, I also like to work on houses. So I spend a lot of time working on my house. You know, what else do I do? I don't know what else I do. I like to travel when I can, that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know. I might write another book at some point. I don't feel compelled to right now.
Hmm.
It's a lot of work. It's hard.
Hmm.
So
What would you write it on?
I have some ideas for other Civil War books. I think one thing I'm really interested in doing at some point is I have coming back to the family thing. I have all these like really crazy family stories. For like my one, I think he's my great great grandfather, uh, got killed by a train. He
Hmm.
was a conductor and he fell and his head and his arms got chopped off. And there's like it's just like awful, awful. But there's all these like really weird family stories like that I think like, I guess every family probably has them, but the fact that like I've collected all of them.
Hmm.
And so I would like to find a way to kind of like weave those together, and kind of how it's been passed down through the generations. I don't really know what this looks like yet. It's a harder thing to write than just like a typical nonfiction book, but that's like an idea in the back of my head that at some point I'd like to figure out how to do.
That'd be really cool. Oh, I love stories like that. Are you reading anything now? For fun? It doesn't have to be Civil War related. Just are you reading interesting stuff? I like that book. I like that
Uh,
bookshelf back there. I guess that's why I ask. Like, what are you reading?
yeah, that's all my Civil War books. What am I reading? I I like to read westerns for fun, like
Mm-hmm.
fiction westerns. I don't know if you've ever read Larry
Louis
McMurtry.
L'Amour.
He's my favorite.
Oh
Yeah,
no,
he's
who's that?
McMurtry. He is a character. He wrote a lot of books. He just died last year, actually.
What was his name?
Um, McMurtry, Mcmurtry. His big book is Lonesome Dove, um, which I don't. He writes a little differently, which is why I like him. It's very realistic, and not really sugar coated or heroic or anything like that. It's just like, yeah, life was really hard back then. There's some very questionable things in his books that are some of which probably bridge into like not politically correct for modern times because they were written 20 30 years ago. But with perspective, I really enjoy his writing.
Oh, for sure.
um, yeah, so he's good. I'm recently reading a lot of like who Dale Carnegie is, the guy who wrote How
Yep.
to Win
How to?
Friends and
Yep.
Influence People. I've been reading a lot of his books because I actually really enjoy his writing and his insights. Again, with a little bit of perspective because they were like, I don't know, he'll just have stuff in his books. It's like, now, ladies, if you're reading, you'll want to skip this next paragraph because it won't interest you. It's just like perfectly acceptable advice for anyone. So
Mm-hmm.
just funny stuff like that. But
What other books does he have other than How to Win Friends? Because I've listened to that one on Audible
uh-huh.
maybe like 3 times over the years.
Yeah.
What else does
Yeah,
he
that's
have
that's
that's
a very good one. I'm reading right now How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, which is very interesting. I like that one. Those are the only two that I've read so far. Um, but yeah, he's interesting perspective on some things. And then I also like to read history stuff, right? So I just read a little while back, Burying My Heart at Wounded Knee,
Oh, sure.
which I hadn't gotten to yet. It's crazy. Like there's so many incredible books and just like the time to actually get to them. But yeah, that was a really good one. So I'll pick up stuff like that every now and then, and I have to read something happy to kind of balance it out. But
Hmm. Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast on Kit Carson and researching what his life was
yeah,
like. Kind of. So I don't know
yeah,
how familiar you are with him specifically, but is that
a little
era
bit.
of Western
Yeah,
expansion? 18, maybe I think he was born early 1800s, but about
right.
1830s through 18. He had a little stint as a Union officer, and
Uh huh.
then went on. Beginning of his life, he married into the Cheyenne tribe and had children through there. Then his
Right.
wife died, and then he married into a different tribe, and so he had
Hmm.
like six different languages he could speak from living
Oh wow, I
down
didn't
in
know that.
from living with
That's
various
crazy.
tribes and all this stuff, and then kind of forced into as a Union officer into fighting against the Navajo. And then after
Okay.
that, I think he kind of, from what I've heard, regretted it and then tried to give
Hmm.
them back their land, and then ended
Hmm.
up kind of being a peacemaker between the government and the tribes at the end of his life.
Yeah.
And so it was totally an up and down from
Wow.
living with them to fighting them to making peace with them
Right.
as the West expanded,
Yeah,
from pre
that's
Civil
a
War.
crazy life. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Just random, and I went down the rabbit hole of him. So that was
Yeah.
neat.
No, that's really cool.
Yeah, I looked
Yeah.
up those books that you mentioned, and I'm gonna buy that one of the Union's Civil War guys. You said the
Yeah, it's a
Union.
really
What
good
was it
one.
called?
Yeah. Uh, Marching Home, that one.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds awesome
Yeah.
because I haven't gotten that perspective before.
Yeah. The other one I'd really recommend is The Cause of All Nations,
Hmm.
which came out not too long ago. And that is about the impact that the US Civil War had on the rest of the world, which
Oh,
again is a very interesting perspective that you don't typically learn in school. Um, and that it just completely changed. I read it while I was writing my book, and I included quite a bit of information from it because it just completely changed my perspective on kind of how meaningful the Civil War was. I think, anyone who I'm very used to people responding to finding out that I'm interested in the Civil War being like, you can tell from how they respond, they're just like, that doesn't matter. It's like, no, it really does. Like, if you want to understand the modern social context of the United States and literally the entire world and like the history of democracy, Um, the Civil War is like it. That's where it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so this book really does a great job of explaining that. There's a lot of really good stories and stuff in there. So I'd actually recommend that over Marching Home if you prioritize them because it's just such a huge picture of everything.
Awesome. Very cool. I'll check that out. I love that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I don't have any more questions really. I can end the recording here and then we can wrap up if you have, unless you have
Sure.
anything else you want to mention or dive into.
I don't think so. You asked really good questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Go ahead and give a shout out, kind of what you do, where you're at, what you're looking forward to, and then I'll wrap
Uh,
that.
yeah. So, what do I do? I am I guess, amateur historian who published a nonfiction book about the Civil War. I am doing my best to promote it as a small author. And where I hope to go, I hope to share the story of Captain Brooks with as many people as possible because I think it's worth telling, and it's a lot about our history as a country, where we were, where we are now. I think it's important.
Rock on. Alrighty.